Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Rugby Site podcast. I'm your host, Max, and I'm joined today by Simon from GainLine Analytics. Simon's previously been a video analyst for the Melbourne Rebels and the Wallabies. Thanks for joining us today, Simon.
Max, it's my pleasure. My pleasure to be here.
I guess as a starting point, GainLine Analytics, can you tell us a bit about how it started and what you do?
So GainLine Analytics started around 12 years ago with Ben Darwin. So Ben, former Wallaby, Brumby, played for a period of time, played through the golden age of Australian rugby, won a few Bledisloe Cups. So you can tell how long ago Ben played. Um, but during his whole career, and he's quite open about this, didn't necessarily think he was one of the best players going around, but often felt it was the system that allowed him to play to his capacity in that way. He would talk about how he would line up against the All Blacks and say, well, pound for pound, I'm not necessarily a better player than the opposition, and the rest of the Wallabies are not necessarily better players, but as a team and as a collective, they seem to sort of do better, win Bledisloe Cups and so that kind of stuck with him as a player. And then following his retirement, going into coaching, he would talk about doing the same thing as a coach, say at the Western Force, and not winning anything, and then going to Suntory in Japan and winning everything, but not necessarily changing anything he was doing as a coach, but getting completely different results. So again, there was something about the actual individual skill, whether it's the skill of a player or skill of a coach, getting different results depending on the different environment that he was in. So that stuck with him very much. And he came back to Melbourne to become the video analyst and scrum coach of the Melbourne Rebels. And that's where I met Ben, because I was just through coaching pathways here I was based in Melbourne. I was doing rep coaching, junior pathways, and I had managed to, through circumstance, get a role as a video analyst for when the Wallabies were in Melbourne, and that sort of cascaded on, and that meant that I was sort of in the program and assisted with the Wallabies for a number of years through there, and that enabled me to then get a role with Ben at the Rebels. And doing that, so that's how my relationship with Ben formed. And then, so Ben and I worked together at the Rebels for a period of time, which of course is a wonderful environment to be involved in, especially with a startup franchise. But when we look back at it now, you're sort of doing all the things that works against sort of the elements that we look at now, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But Ben did that for a couple of years, went to Japan, came back and said, I've got this idea for a business. And the business was a database of all professional rugby union, rugby league players in the world. And the idea is that a club would come to the database, come to Ben and say, we want to know if a number 10 or a number 7 is coming off contract. We've got a position to fill. Who are all the players that are available in the next contract cycle? That was the idea for the business. However, during that process, what Ben noticed was the way the database was set up is that it was set up by team, and he noticed that teams that recruited in a certain way, whether they went and bought talent, or teams that recruited in a certain way, whether they developed internally, got different results. Teams that tended to go buy, teams that tended to go and acquire talent, which you'd say, well, we're going to get the best skill, therefore we should get results, were not getting those results. Teams that tended to maintain talent or develop talent internally were getting better results. So it was going against what you would perceived the result should be. If you go and get the best talent, you should get results. A good example of that for Super Rugby historians, 2013 Highlanders, when they went and recruited 4 or 5 All Blacks. They went from 6 or 9 wins the previous season to 3 wins. And that was a really good example of that sort of in play. So this was when his own experience as a player, I'm not necessarily a great player, but the system was driving something. Then seeing this across different competitions, different sports in rugby union, rugby league, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, this light bulb moment to saying, actually, there's something here. There's something that involves around recruitment that drives performance. It's not just about skill. It's about system. It's about how players are brought together. So through this process, Ben and I and a third party, a guy named Pat Ferguson, who was a student at Melbourne University. He went on to get a PhD at Harvard, so he was a pretty smart fellow.
Yes.
Started laying down the original metrics associated. So we had this idea, but we said, well, how do we formalize this? So we developed what was called TWI, or Teamwork Index, and it was a way of measuring almost the recruitment philosophy of an organization, and that's ultimately where what drove GainLine Analytics, or where it came from, our ability to actually objectively measure the recruitment philosophy of an organization. That's what really where we have grown from.
Yeah, so let's start with that, the TWR, the Teamwork Index.
Yeah.
What does that measure specifically when you look at an organization, both sports and corporate?
Yeah. So TWI is a way for us to look at the way I described it then, the organizational philosophy. So and the way to bookend that is, are we a build organization or are we a buy organization? So say in rugby terms, are we a build organization? So, are we a Crusaders, for example, or are we really, we can look at Mono Pacifica in a way because they've had to be a buy organization because they don't have the pathways, they don't have the structure, so they've had to bring players in. Or if we look at the Northern Hemisphere, a lot of the French clubs tend to be buy clubs because they tend to go and get talent. Where, say, Toulouse, for example, uses their espoirs and brings their academy players through, so they tend to be more of a build organization, even though absolutely they top up. So that's what TWI measures, so you can look at that, but it's not just a case of buying or acquiring. It's what are the levers that you have associated with your club that assists in your recruitment. What is the structure underneath you? So Leinster are the really good example of this, that they have this beautiful little bubble in Dublin, all these little private schools that they can call upon, that they have this structure. But they also have the other lever in Ireland, especially in the Republic of Ireland, is that they have the tax breaks on top. That means that the players don't necessarily want to leave Ireland because they don't necessarily have to, because they don't need the big pay packet elsewhere because they've got these tax breaks. And so that helps this whole recruitment philosophy in that way, to drive this whole structure of how they bring their players through and retain, because retention is an important part of that. So essentially that's what TWI helps us measure. It looks at all these different factors to understand what the club is doing to develop their squad.
And I mean, a few of the clubs you mentioned there. So the Crusaders, who have been the pinnacle of excellence at Super Rugby in New Zealand for the last, 8, 9 years, if not longer. Leinster, who are on top of the world right now. They seem to have three-quarters of the Irish team, plus some top internationals that they get in every year. So there's clearly a representation, or a direct correlation between a good TWI and success, both on the field and off it. Are there any other sports organizations that you look at the moment, maybe in different sports, where you go, yeah, they look like they've got it right?
Well, I mean, rugby league. So Penrith Panthers, for example, are a really good example. So when we look at them as an organisation over time, you could see that their TWI was building up a number of seasons before their first premiership, or their latest premiership in 2021, and then obviously they got four in a row, and it was building towards that. So we could see the signals of what they were doing to building towards that. And of note, we talk about all these different factors that drive TWI and what an organization needs. And one of them is structure, pathways. And so when the Panthers won their 2021 premiership, they were the second youngest group in the NRL. So you don't necessarily need age and experience. What you need is shared experience. You need understanding in the group. And so what it means is that a lot of that understanding was driven through their pathway.
And was it 2021 where the Panthers won the NRL, the Jersey Flag, and the New South Wales Cup as well? Was that
Yeah,
year?
yeah. A lot of that time, so a lot of those players were coming through, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be the case. And a really good example of that is, say, Irish rugby. They haven't necessarily always been great in the juniors, but it's how they bring those players through and at the top. And of course, part of the Irish national team pathway is Leinster. So it's all the ecosystem in that way. And a club, in a way, is the same. So a club has the same ecosystem as a national team. It's just how you look at it and how you break up those particular components. Because you can look at the Irish national team in the same way and say that Leinster is part of that ecosystem. There are all these different elements of cohesion. So even though we talk about TWI in one of the principles of cohesion, that understanding, what we talk about with cohesion is the three Ps: people, position, program. So there's the understanding between people is really important. How, just so people know how the other person plays and what they do in certain situations. Understanding to position. So you obviously, everyone has a role knowledge. So inside center, outside center, so 12 and 13, like they're specific roles. Defensively, a 13 has a different role as a 12. So if you swap that, you've got a different role, but now you're also playing with different people inside you, outside you, the fullback's in a different position. It's like wingers. If you swap from 11 to 13, yeah, you're still a winger, but you're carrying on a different side, you're defending on a different side. So there are these subtle changes that make it. And then there's program knowledge, and program knowledge is really important. So game plan, language, style, those sort of things. So if you have a good structure and a development pathway of a player coming through, they tend to have that program knowledge as they come through. So when they come through the program and essentially debut for the first team, they already have a lot of that program knowledge in there. So, and I use the Highlanders example of 2013. You had all these massively experienced players come in, but they've always done other ways of doing things. So instead of having a bunch of guys that have sort of got one set of knowledge or one language doing the same thing, under pressure doing the same thing, you had a group of players under pressure. They revert back to the way they've done things the last 10 years. And Amar Nonu at, say, the Hurricanes and a bit of the Blues, under pressure, maybe is stepping left or stepping right in the defensive line, where Brad Thorne, who was at somewhere else in the defensive line, is stepping left in, and that's where the gaps are created under those circumstances. So program knowledge is really important. So, look at Razor at the Crusaders for that period of time. He was in the Canterbury Crusader system as a player coach for 24 seasons. So the institutional knowledge that he had through that program was just immense. And that's a really important part of what sort of the whole cohesion story is around that program knowledge.
Yeah, and just picking up on a few words you've used there. So shared experience is kind of self-explanatory, right? It's the amount of experience you've had together with somebody and that you've collectively used together and you can fall back on when you're under pressure. But cohesion, how do you measure cohesion?
Yeah, so when we use the word cohesion, that's our word for understanding. So it's not social cohesion. So it's not a psychological measure. That's someone else's job. Ultimately, and I'll say this in a crude sense, we don't care if people like each other or not.
Yeah.
We care if people know how the other person next to them is playing. So there are plenty of stories of sportsmen that don't like each other but play very well together.
Yeah.
It's ultimately about that objective level of understanding.
So it's an understanding of the guy inside and outside you
Yeah,
and what they do in certain situations.
under pressure, what are they going to do? What's their line speed? What are they going to do when they're coming up for the line, or when the defender's coming? How do they step? Where do they tackle? Are they going low? When they're going into contact, as they go to place, where are they placing? So the clean out, because in a game of rugby union there are tens of thousands of those individual actions. So if you can improve every one of them just by a tiny bit, that's how you make those incremental gains. 10,000 incremental gains in a game, that's where you get the advantage. So if you know how that person's going to go into contact and place and you're cleaning out the threat like that multiple times, that's where you get that advantage. So that's where that innate understanding of what your teammate's going to do. And that's where that understanding or cohesion comes into it. So the way we measure, at the professional game, we've got a database of 80,000+ games of professional rugby union. So we know where every player has played, who they've played with, and what position they've played in. So we can physically measure it. We have algorithms that basically develop a set of metrics for a game. So we've got 200 plus individual markers that measure a game of rugby union that give us overall strength, strength of units, forwards, seam defence, attack spine launch, edge D, backfield. And so we can look at all these just from a cohesion perspective to understand how a team is functioning versus an opposition. Or your cohesion might be in the outside backs, for example, and not in the what we call the attack spine launch. So say the 8, 9, 10, 12. So you might not be able to use your backs cohesion because your 9, 10, 12 can't actually use the ball effectively to use your outside backs. So that's how because we've got this knowledge of where everyone's played, that's how we use it. And doing this for 10 years, we've got a good understanding of when the cohesion numbers say X, it means this on the field from
Yeah.
that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. So on that, positionally specific, does certain groups or units cohesion matter more than others?
Oh yeah, definitely. So and again, this 10 plus years of research. So high relationship positions really, really matter. So that what I describe as the attack spine launch, that 9, 10, 12, 9, 10, 12, 13, it's
Yeah.
really important to control your attack with it. So, and a good stat, Super Rugby, for example, only one team has ever won the Super Rugby title with a 10 not either debuted for their Super Rugby team or not come through their system in the 25 plus years of Super Rugby.
So only one team has bought a 10 in from a different system and then won the Super Rugby title.
Because it's a high relationship position. And so to run a team effectively, to make decisions, attack decisions, defensive decisions, territory decisions are really, really important. So that is a critical important position. Hooker to locks, critical position. Back row, not so much, but then back row controls seam defense.
Yeah.
So there's still every team has a strength and weakness. Some of it not so much. Outside backs or wings, not so important, but then edge D is also important.
Yeah.
So every position is important, but some are more important than others. It's a bit of the Lord of the Flies.
It's really interesting, but it kind of makes sense as well. Like when you're just watching rugby, like your 8, 9, 10, 12, 13 is critical both on attack and defense. They're your game drivers generally,
Well,
your 9 and 10, right?
and very much so in defence. If you get bent, especially that midfield, 10, 12, 13, if you get bent in the first phase, your defence is always backpedaling. And so then you're always struggling in defence. If you can maintain, if you have a good midfield defence, if those guys can work well in defence and you can have a good defensive line and not get bent or broken in that first or second phase, then your defensive line is a lot stronger. If you get bent in that first phase, your defensive line is going to be struggling a little bit. Yeah, come backwards.
So clearly there's a really strong correlation between cohesion and a team's success at the end of a season or end of a cup or end of a World Cup cycle or whatever that looks like. How can you, as a coach or as a player, influence cohesion in your team? How can you make your team more cohesive?
Yeah, so there's a the long burn and the short burn associated with that. So if we talk about from a short-term perspective, so obviously stability in selection is really important if you want to make it, and that's common sense. So if you're constantly changing your team, if you're constantly changing team or constantly changing position, it's going to be hard for guys to develop that understanding either as in the group or positionally. So that's sort of the easiest way to do it. The counter to that though is we know in contact sports, rugby union, rugby league, that you're going to get injuries and you're going to get churn, in selection. Hyperstability is not necessarily a long-term strategy to have, because if you could select the same 15 or the same 23 each week, that's great. It's great for cohesion. However, if you did that for all of your season and then you go into your semi-final and you've got two injuries, it's going to be an issue, because all of a sudden you're going to have holes in there. So that's where the trade-off is between trying to keep the team together versus trying to create a system where you have cohesion depth
Yeah.
in it. So, but primarily from a season perspective, trying to keep the role stability is really important and trying to reduce the amount of change. But from a long burn perspective, is trying to create that cohesion depth through and basically bringing players through and whether or not it's using the bench to try and develop combinations through there, and then using the grades to develop combinations coming through, using the juniors to develop combinations coming through. What you're trying to do ultimately is not develop cohesion in the first team, because if the more you're developing cohesion in the first team, the more work you're doing in the first team, the more games you're giving away. Ultimately, it's about return on investment. And it depends what your rationale of the club is. If the primary goal is to get a first team win, then you're using everything below that to develop up the first team. So you're using the development pathways to try and gain that advantage in the top team. If you're having to develop cohesion in the top team, you're giving away games. You're going backwards before you go forwards.
Yeah.
And so it's thinking about how you're using all those relationships and combinations coming through from that perspective. But part of that is also through the recruitment cycle each year is what are we doing from a recruitment perspective, is because when everyone goes to recruit, they're generally always thinking about attack. You're thinking about what this person gives us in attack. No one necessarily always thinks about defence.
Yeah.
Cohesion in rugby union manifests itself most strongest in defence. And a really good example of that, say in Super Rugby this year, is Mono Pacifica are looking fantastic. Artie Sevilla, oh my God, isn't he doing great? But they're still shipping 30 plus points.
Yeah.
Because it's still a relatively low cohesion team. The Western Force. Like the Western Force, they're all talented players. Like there's 8 Wallabies in there. They're all decent players and they can score some absolute worldy of tries, which we saw on the weekend
Yeah.
against when they played the Chiefs, but they're still shipping 30 plus points because they're still building as a group. And so part of that is from a long burn perspective, developing the squad is if you are churning a squad, it's thinking about if you are getting rid of players, you can always replace skill. You can't replace shared experience. You can't replace cohesion. So it's thinking about that process as well. Would we rather bring players through from our system or bring them in from external?
Yeah, and you've said it a few times there, particularly on performance, where people prioritize attack over defense, and defense is a more cohesive side of the game, right?
Yeah.
How can a coach or an analyst sort of assess a player's performance through the lens of cohesion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, that question almost summarizes sort of cohesion analytics in a way. So, for example, if you see a line break or the line's bent, like the fan in the stand will look at that and go, well, that's a bad tackle by that player. They're not very good. And it's looked at as almost a skill deficiency. We will look at it as what's the cohesion relationship of that player to the player around them,
Yeah,
and what decisions were made to create those poor relationships in that way. And so was it a selection decision or was it a recruitment decision from last year or the year before? And so in a way, it's understanding that if a player makes a poor decision, is it a function of their skill or is it a function of the relationships around them? So if a player, passes a cutout pass to nobody, is it because they're normally passing to a player they normally pass to?
yeah,
That way, the player they pass to is not there because they're actually passing to a new player that's not used to that running line. So that's where it is. Or there's a missed or sort of there's a line break. Is because there was a bad read. Is it a bad read because those two players have never actually defended next to each other, and so they're not making the right call when it comes to that necessarily that defensive alignment. And people might say, well, you've practiced it at training. I've got video of international level Premiership Rugby, URC, Super Rugby of exactly that happening. Guys playing for the first time together, just running opposite directions and somebody running through the gap.
yeah. So someone's on defense, and he played for a team last year where they jam when their numbers down, and comes into a new team where they jockey, and one goes in, one goes out, and it's not because of a skill deficiency; it's Cohesion.
Absolutely. I've got a great video of literally it's it's pillar post or whatever you want to use it, and there's literally a wallaby and a former England and British and Irish line there in by the ruck, and they literally run in opposite directions as someone runs in between them and they score a try. They're not bad players. They just they have not defended together, and they lack program knowledge, and they lack that shared understanding between them. And so that's when you're judging. You cannot necessarily judge the player. You've just got to judge the circumstance. And this is where often teams will have to bring in a player. We don't have a lock.
Yeah.
We are down in lock, so we've got to bring in an experienced lock. Okay. How is that player jumped before? Does he take a quick step forward before he steps back? What do the props have to do in the line out to take care of that? Is that lock working with the props in the jump? Okay, he's never going to change. We have to now adapt our props to his lift
Yeah.
because that's the way he's done it for 15 years. And so that's part of it as well, is some context to the way people do it to get people to adapt. Because if that player can't adapt to the way you're doing it, then potentially you have to adapt to the way they're doing it. Else you're going to be stuck in the middle ground where it's just not going to work either way.
So you were involved in analytics for the Wallabies for about 10 years. When you first started to when you finished, how was the outlook on both cohesion and analytics as a whole? How much did it change over that period?
It became more in depth. So there was just more data points. There was more, and it goes like with any sport. There was more ability to look at the level of data available and the desire to look at more data to the point where player reviews and to the point where a lot of it was player driven, as in, here's the room, here are the computers, and basically it was often player driven. And this is the Rebels as well. And
Yeah.
this is the same for every. This is no different for probably every professional franchise. That it is now common practice, and it's probably an age thing as well. Just the nature of in the modern era, which is the age of players, everyone's very visual and everyone likes snippets. Just the age bracket of players that picture tells 1,000 words. That the availability of the data from a coach's perspective is one thing, but the availability of vision, that overlay for players, is the use is a lot greater than what it was in that way, because you could see this transition over time. So and so, you didn't necessarily make that tackle very well, or you missed that. No, I didn't. Let's look at the vision. So no one
Yeah,
can hide, like no one can hide these days.
yeah, video doesn't lie, right?
Yeah, so back in
Don't
the
lie.
stories back at like early on, especially with early on with GPS, you literally have guys in the background just doing extras, like literally doing extras to try and get the numbers up. Um,
Yeah, we've heard of stories at club rugby of guys putting their GPSs on the halfback so they can run a bit further for the week, and then coaches sitting there with the video and the GPS numbers and going, these don't sort of add up.
yeah, but I think yeah, the application of um, the use of data. I mean, obviously, it's just improved, but then obviously the statistical application into the data has improved a lot as well. As in, what are the numbers telling us? There's still there's going to be a transition, and again, this is my experience, and this is a great thing about being a sort of a video analyst, and you get to see different coaches, and you get to see how different people work, and literally come across coaches that can't. Some coaches can't even turn a computer on, and others can reprogram their laptop.
Yeah.
And so being able to communicate what they want when they want it is a sort of a real skill. But in saying that, I think because of a lot of the modern coaches now are going to be players that come from the environment where they have been exposed as
Yeah, more
players.
exposure, right, as players. Is there a coach you've worked with that you sort of thought, wow, they use data really powerfully?
Not necessarily, not necessarily data. It's more, I think, my experience of working with different coaches on how they've chosen to use the analyst, as in some coaches I've seen that say, go find me something, or what do what are you seeing? Or other coaches that say, I want XYZ. And I've seen different coaches, because my role is always, I've just, like, I was never a senior person. I was just always in the background. Because often some coaches would come in and they bring their analyst in and they've actually been working together for a long period of time. And sometimes you see these really, when it's a cohesion thing, you see these really strong working relationships that the analyst absolutely knows what the coaches want. And I think I've seen some really good working relationships of how those have worked together. And so, and that's a really, I think that's a really important part around it as well. That if you have a coach that knows what they want and the analyst basically can provide that information in the format and the language that the coaches wanted as well. I think there was a period, I think it's settling down in sport in general, that when the sort of the data side started to pick up, there was probably a lot of information overload across sports. But I think it's probably settling more. But I have to say, and this is the privilege that we have at GainLine, that I get to experience different environments, whether that's rugby union or football, as in soccer, or I've been in sort of environments in US professional sport that the level of sophistication of data usage in sort of rugby union and rugby league is not as great as in, say, the Northern Hemisphere in North America and in Europe. But part of that's probably driven by cost. Like there's not,
And resource, right?
yeah,
It's
there's
impressive, particularly in America, right? The amount of cameras they have, angles on everything, amount of data in the gym, it's next level, right?
it is next level, but that's they can afford it
Yeah.
in a way. Like everyone will scream and scream like a stuck pig that they don't have any money, but there's not a lot of money in Southern Hemisphere sports. So um,
And data, do you think it's more powerfully used as positive reinforcement or as a tool to work on getting better, or do you think it's a combination of both?
that's a good question. Well, now I will answer this question saying I have not been at the coal front in the use of data with players for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years now. So I don't really know how players are using it or coaches are using it. Um, but it really comes down to, again, and it comes down to the coach's style. Because again, watching at different coaches, some coaches are mentoring type coaches, some coaches are confrontational type coaches. And so it really depends on the particular style of who's using it. But I have to say, in talking to a lot of people, there is very much a conversational piece around the type of modern athlete,
Yeah.
the type of human they are these days, compared to, like, it was a bit more of, whether it's right or wrong, historically it was a little bit more tough love,
Yeah.
where these days the human, young man and woman, it's they approach things differently. And so
Your
whether
type,
or not that's taken into account.
your type of learning style, right? A1 to A4, C1 to C4 for coaches being more authoritarian in the
Yeah.
olden days generally versus probably being a little bit
And
kinder.
we know and experience. I mean, my own personal experience, between, say, coaching men's sport and coaching women's sport, men and women, boys and girls, they are different animals in themselves, and so there's different ways to approach that as well.
Yeah, so we've talked a few times about if you're developing cohesion in the first team, you're probably giving up a bit of a performance, maybe some results, where it's really important to get it done in development cycles. I listened to a clip with Scott Robertson before talking about Richie Mo'unga and Mitchell Drummond in particular, where
Yeah,
those
yeah,
two came up Canterbury. They played New Zealand 20s with Scott Robertson. Then they moved to the Crusaders. Then they're in the All Blacks together. And
Yep.
their shared experience in those important positions as a 9 and 10
Yep.
are really important. Organizationally, we hear a lot about alignment these days from your executives and your board to your coaches
Yes.
to players and your development staff. How important is, I guess, coaching cohesion, management cohesion in the overall success of an organization?
You mean sort of cohesion from a staff
Yeah,
perspective?
from a
Yeah.
staff.
Yeah. So, yeah, still important. And this is where we sort of talk about that program, the program component of cohesion, and in a very broad sense. So, for example, you have a whole system that you've developed. Say you have a game plan in the first team, and say the seconds have a very similar game plan, maybe slightly diluted, third slightly diluted, Colts, juniors, same language. So as a player comes through the system, they're not necessarily having to learn anything new. It just gets expanded upon. And you've got a first team coach. Say hypothetically you change the first team coach and they absolutely change everything that's the first team is playing. Basically, it's made everything redundant underneath. And so that's where the institutional knowledge of an organization is really, really important. So in a way, the the club in itself has to have ideally has to have a way of doing things, and then the staff fit into it in that way. If there is a reason to change that, it's an organizational decision that goes with it because they need to understand the ramifications. There's a thing we call the pendulum, is that if you make a small decision at the top, it actually has massive ramifications underneath. Because you could make one small decision, say in the first team, about we're going to do a different thing. It actually makes basically the roll-on effect down the system means that all what's happening below has become irrelevant in a way. So having staff knowledge or having institutional knowledge is really important. So and again, often we talk about the Crusaders having good systems for their players, but historically they have good systems for their coaches as well. They come through their system as well. To be honest, they struggled last year because a lot of the top end of their coaches were taken off to the All Blacks, and that's probably one of the many factors from last year that drove their results, as well as many other things. Um, but being able to have that development pathway for coaches is almost as important because you are developing those relationships to the players. You know what works at training and you know what works that doesn't. You know how to get the best out of them in that way. You know what the player will do under a certain situation in that way. And you have that institutional knowledge as well. So if you go to change things, you have a knowledge of the organization in that way.
And you've talked a bit about return of investment on cohesion as well. How do you quantify that? Like if you build a new gym at your club, it's easy to see players get stronger and fitter, or if you sign a marquee signing for a professional sports organization and you sell more merchandise, it's easy to quantify in a way. How do you quantify the return that cohesion brings?
A good question, actually. How do you quantify?
Is that just results? Is that a
Well, no, it's not just results. So I'll give you an example. So we've done some work around brand engagement in Cohesion. So with development systems, you're basically bringing players through. So Cohesion, for example, perfect scenario is you have development systems, you have your players come through, and so you have a player debuting that's been in the system. So the general crowd, fan base, knows the player. And so there is engagement with the player. And then that player, generally high cohesion environments, players tend to stay in the system for a long period of time. You have engagement with that player through. So it actually drives brand and fan engagement as well as success. So you have that connection. The best example of that for us is the AFL, Australian Football League. So they have trade policy dictated by the AFL that means that players have to stay at clubs for extended periods of time. So it naturally drives high cohesion. So the AFL for us, of all the competitions we measure, is the highest cohesion competition globally of any comp. And AFL is a good game, and I enjoy watching a good game of AFL. Personally, I'd rather watch a game of under 14s rugby, but it is what it is. I live in Melbourne. I've got to work with it.
Yeah.
But it's still a good game. It's an athletic game, and but the crowds. A bad game of AFL will get 45,000 people, or maybe 26,000 in Sydney or up in Brisbane. But the fan engagement is unbelievable. So a club drafts a player at 18, and they literally could stay at the same club for 14 years. So if I'm an 18-year-old kid and I see this 18-year-old, when they retire at 32, I'm also 32, and I have two kids, and I've already indoctrinated those kids into that club. And so there is the the natural ability of AFL to drive that innate fan engagement because you go along the hero's journey with that. And so that in a way is this other aspect of high cohesion environments drive this brand engagement, fan engagement with it. And ultimately success drives those other, you want sponsors, you want crowds, all those sort of things. But even when you have down years, the crowd sticks with you.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what the crowd figures were for the Crusaders last year, whether or not they stuck with them.
That would be interesting. So interesting that AFL sees the highest cohesion. Are there any sports that you see significantly lower cohesion levels with across different teams?
Well, yeah, a really good example for a low cohesion competition is the A League. And the
Right.
A-League, so historically has always been quite low, and it's a good example. So Auckland FC,
Yeah.
first year, can win the league, hasn't won the title yet because they play in finals. But, and historically that has happened previously. Western Sydney Wanderers, first year made the finals. Another team, I don't think it was MacArthur, I can't remember, another startup franchise very early on won the competition because it's naturally a low cohesion competition. So you don't necessarily need as much cohesion to win. When you do, when you have a higher level of cohesion, which Sydney FC did a number of years ago, you are very dominant for
Right.
a period of time. And so that's an example of when you are a low cohesion comp, a startup franchise can win easily. So unlike the AFL, you get teams like startup franchises like the Gold Coast Suns that have, I don't know if they've ever made the finals, and they've been around for 12 or 13 years.
Much higher bar to get to the
Oh,
top level.
absolutely. Absolutely. It's a much, much higher bar. And when you drop off, when you have a fall, like North Melbourne Football Club did, it takes forever to get back up because of the level of cohesion you need to be successful in that competition. So from a cohesion perspective, at the professional level of most sports, the differential of skill is not great. It's the differential of cohesion that's the difference.
So
That's a differentiator.
putting that in a real life example, obviously the Rebels unfortunately aren't a part of the Super Rugby competition anymore.
Yeah.
Do you think that that will benefit Australian rugby, allowing more cohesion between players at club level and then into the international team?
Eventually, but
Yeah.
not in the short term because you've got a groups of players joining together. So they're having to build that new sets of cohesion in those teams at the moment. So some of the teams have to go back a little bit to go forward. So, but some people have taken some advantage. So let's say the Queensland Reds have actually got some Queenslanders coming back. So that's sort of doing all right. Brumbies only took one, maybe one or two. The Western Force, they're a bit of a mix anyway. And the Waratahs is probably the one that took the most, and so they've got this bit of a mix, slightly offset by the fact that some of those guys have played Wallabies together, but it always sort of manifests itself that when teams like that get under a little bit of a pressure, they tend to struggle a little bit. So it's like anyone knows their Super Rugby history. It's when the Cheetahs and the old Cats back in Super Rugby, which was a combination of two South African Super Rugby teams, literally had 9 Springboks in them, but it was a combination of two franchises, and they were woeful because it was like two groups come together, and you've
Yeah.
basically just got all these disconnects in the
Low
team.
cohesion environment.
Yep.
You actually sent me a YouTube video just before this, the rise and decline of Australian rugby, which I thought was really interesting, particularly from a cohesion perspective. Sort of talks about Australian rugby through their golden era compared to European nations and how there's quite a linear correlation between cohesiveness and success. If there was one point to take out of this chat we've had for the last 45 minutes around cohesiveness and the importance of cohesion and culture for team success, one tip to allow organizations to be better at it, what would you say?
Long-term thinking. So it's really about long-term growth. It's you're going to say 1 point, but my 1 point is probably going to go on for 10 minutes. But it's really about what are the implications of your decision now, and is the decision I make, am I comfortable with the next person who's going to fill my role is going to get the benefit for that decision? That's a real critical thing, especially say governance of clubs. If I'm saying on the board, if I'm on the committee of a club, am I willing to make a decision where somebody in the future is going to get the benefit of my decision? I think that's a really critical thing to think about. It's about the long-term decisions. And so, say, for example, let's just say last year with the Crusaders, they did not make any short-term decisions based on that really poor season. They stuck to their principles. They stuck to what they knew and what had driven them success. They kept the coach. They kept all the things in place, and they are where they are now because they knew what they looked like before. So, I mean, that's a good example of an organisation understanding what sort of have driven their success in that way. So,
No, thanks, Simon. Thanks for your time. It's been really interesting hearing about the importance of cohesion in a team environment, and particularly from an analytical perspective, looking past the tackles missed or carries made and looking at analysing games from a more cohesion perspective. For people that want to learn more about team cohesion, organizational governance, where can they find you and GainLine?
yeah, so check out our website, www.gainline.biz, and there's just a contact us page. Have a look through, subscribe to the GainLine report. On the website, there's a link tree link, so you can subscribe to our various social medias of choice on there. But look, get in contact. Feel free to reach out. And yeah, just follow us on the socials, subscribe to the newsletter. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, that you mentioned the YouTube video I sent you. If anyone has a chance, so there's a doco that was made by a good friend of ours, Matt Durrant, called Gold Digger: Search for Australian Rugby. So he made it at the beginning of 2020. So look it out. It's on Apple TV, might be on some other streaming services. So Gold Digger: Search for Australian Rugby. So it's really good insight into how cohesion works, but it's obviously got an Australian bent, but it's applicable for a lot of sort of different sports if you look at it through the cohesion lens.
No, thanks, Simon. Really appreciate your time. This has been the Rugby Side podcast, and we'll see you next time.